Everybody, welcome to this plenary session at the 25th Annual Conference on Global Economic Analysis. Today, we're very fortunate to have two great speakers. We have Bob Staiger, who will be talking about a world trading system for the 21st century. Very timely. As you know, next week, the WTO will start its ministerial conference, the 12th ministerial conference, and lots of challenges in the global trading system right now. Our second speaker will be Trudi Hartzenberg, who will be talking about the Africa Continental Free Trade Agreement. Can the Afcfta put African integration on a new track? I think this is another very important topic, the global trading system and regional integration in Africa. So we're very fortunate to have these two speakers. We'll start with Bob Staiger's presentation. He'll be talking about World Trading System for the 21st Century, his latest book. He's a professor of economics at Dartmouth University and specializes in the study of international trade policy rules and institutions, with particular emphasis on the economics of the GATT and WTO. His research has been extraordinarily important in illuminating the conceptual economic underpinnings of the GATT WTO, and summarized in his book with Kyle Bagwell, The Economics of the World Trading System, updating that now with his A World Trading System for the 21st Century. So with that, let me hand this over to Bob. Bob, you have about 25 minutes. We'll follow that with about 15 minutes of discussion. Then we'll have a transition period of about a minute, and we'll start with Trudi's presentation on the Afcfta and African integration. Bob, the floor is yours.
Okay, thanks, Bob. I'm going to share my screen, and let's just get it full screen. Okay, hopefully everyone can see that. Thanks for the introduction, and thanks for inviting me to GTAP. As I was saying before, it would have been wonderful for all of us to be in Kigali, but obviously that we're used to this now, not always having what we want. But it's great to have the opportunity to talk to people here in this forum. And as Bob said, this is what I'm going to be presenting is actually kind of slides related to a forthcoming book that I have. And this book was written based on the Olin lectures that I gave in 2016. And when you give those lectures, part of the deal is you sign a contract with MIT Press that you will turn those lectures into a book, but the contract doesn't have any date about when you do it. So it's really not a very enforceable contract. Sometimes people do it, sometimes they don't. But anyway, after 6 years, I was able to turn those lectures into a book. So that's what this is, and so I'm going to be kind of giving a broad overview with a focus, hopefully, on things that are interesting to people at GTAP, and in particular, my main focus in terms of the challenges will be on China and on climate change, which hopefully I'll have some interesting things to say. Okay, so the motivation kind of starts from the view that the GATT performed well for much of the 20th century. As we all know, it hosted 8 rounds of multilateral negotiation, and those rounds dismantled a web of restrictions of trade protections that had been in place from the 20s and 30s. And by the end of the Uruguay round, average tariffs on industrial products had been reduced to below 4%, and quantitative restrictions largely removed. But there are many challenges that are piling up to the WTO. Among them, China's 2001 accession has challenged an approach to globalization that was really fundamentally designed with market economies in mind. Also, the rise of large emerging and developing economies more generally has placed new demands on a system that traditionally catered to industrialized country interests. And the rise of offshoring, global supply chains has perhaps changed the nature of trade itself. And more recently, we've had the growing importance of digital trade, which one would have to think raises the question of whether the GATT WTO rules are outdated, since they were created at a time initially when the internet was just in its infancy, and the increasing urgency of climate change and how to address it is confronting the WTO with what role it should be playing in that effort. And meanwhile, while all these challenges have been piling up, integration has been going forward, but not so much through GATT's shallow approach, but rather through deeper forms of integration that are focusing on behind the border measures and increasingly regulatory harmonization. And we're now witnessing a strong backlash in many countries against globalization from those who feel they haven't shared in the gains, also from those who feel that their sovereignty or the sovereignty of their governments is being eroded. So that raises the question, do we need a new world trading system to meet the challenges of the 21st century? And that's what I'm trying to take on in this book. And I'm going to take that on. It's a large and woolly question. And so to make any progress at all, I need some structure. And I'm going to take it on with a structure that I find useful that comes from the literature on the economics of trade agreements. And that structure starts with the view that the design of a trade agreement should reflect its purpose. And the purpose is the problem that the agreement is supposed to be solving. So if we take that view, we should be asking first, well, what is the purpose of a trade agreement? And I want to ask first what the purpose of a trade agreement is in a world stripped of the 21st century challenges that I just enumerated. And I'm going to show that that the economics literature has a very strong and almost uniform view of not uniform, but certainly a predominant view of what that purpose is. And I'm then going to show that the fundamental design features of GATT seem well equipped to serve that purpose, if that's the purpose in the world of the 20th century. And I'll argue that the harmony between the purpose and design can actually help us account for the success of the GATT in the 20th century. So then that sets up the question, well, do any of the 21st century challenges that I enumerated above change the purpose of a trade agreement? Because if they do change the purpose of a trade agreement, then they're likely to require changes in the design of the GATT and now the WTO. On the other hand, if they don't change the purpose of a trade agreement, then they don't seem to require a change in the design of the institution, the WTO, and the WTO ought to be able to handle those challenges. So the answers to these questions can illuminate the nature of the challenges faced by the WTO and the world trading system. So my main findings are that GATT's design does, in fact, transcend many, though not all, of the current challenges faced by the WTO. And I'm going to argue that, in particular, the challenge posed by China's economic model, the challenge posed by the rise of large emerging and developing economies in the world trading system more generally, the challenges of digital trade, and the challenges of accommodating efforts to address climate change can in principle all be addressed by exploiting the logic of GATT's design. So those are a number of the major challenges faced by the WTO. And in that sense, I would argue that the logic of this approach to analysis is useful because it's helping us sort out what the WTO still has right and could handle a number of really important challenges by applying its basic principles, maybe in creative ways, to address these challenges. On the other hand, the rise of offshoring and the push for regulatory harmonization as an end in itself, I'll argue, may actually be changing the purpose of trade agreements and therefore creating a need for more fundamental changes in the GATT-WTO. But at the end of the day, if I were to kind of summarize in a bumper sticker what the advice from the research I'm summarizing in this book is, it would be that the best advice for designing a world trading system for the 21st century is probably not Mark Zuckerberg's famous move fast and break things, but rather the ubiquitous World War II UK motto, keep calm and carry on. And I'm not claiming with that advice that reforms to the world trading system are not needed or that all is well at the WTO. Far from it. I think there are useful reforms and many have written on those that could help. But what I am claiming is that the basic architecture of the GATT-WTO and of the GATT in particular is well suited guide the design of the world trading system of the 21st century. Okay, so what's a key starting point? Well, for me, a key starting point is the WTO's legitimacy is maybe perhaps surprisingly not built on the case for free trade. Rather, it's built on the case for internalizing international policy externalities. And just as a spoiler alert, in case I don't get to much else or people have to leave, if the GATT WTO was well designed to handle this international externality emanating from unilateral trade policy choices in the 20th century, and if the 21st century challenges faced by the WTO do not change the nature of these externalities, then the WTO will be well designed to handle the challenges of the 21st century. And that's the basic logic that I'm pursuing throughout the book and also throughout this talk. Okay, so what is the purpose of a trade agreement according to the literature, a broad swath of the literature on trade agreements? Well, in a broad set of environments, the purpose of the trade agreement is the same, and that is, in technical jargon, is to eliminate terms of trade manipulation from tariffs and expand market access to efficient levels, and by doing that, to provide an escape from a terms of trade-driven prisoner's dilemma. Now, that's the technical jargon, but in simple terms, it's a very simple point, and that is when countries unilaterally impose protection, they tend to injure foreign exporters who end up depressing their prices in order to try to stay in the market, now facing these higher hurdles to jump over the tariffs and get into the market. Well, that depressing exporter price is causing hurt to the foreign exporters, and it's also reducing the costs of what they're selling into the domestic market once you take account also of the tariff revenue that's being collected. And what that means is the unilateral choices of governments in their trade policy end up imposing some of the costs of their trade policy choices onto foreign entities who are not part of their voting public or part of the welfare that they typically take into account when they set their policies. And anytime in economics, when I'm making choices where I'm getting some benefits, but I'm not paying all the costs, then I'm going to tend to do too much of that from an efficient point of view or a global social planner point of view. And that is the essence of the inefficiency, according to the terms of trade theory, that a trade agreement can correct. And it turns out, and I won't have time to talk through this, but that's a large part of what the first part of the book does, is in many different environments, academic papers have come to the same conclusion that the fundamental problem can be interpreted as a terms of trade manipulation problem, and the trade agreements are fundamentally about providing an escape from that problem. Okay, well, if that's the purpose of a trade agreement, what about the design of GATT? And does it seem to be focused well on rules that seem like they would actually solve that kind of a problem? And the basic architecture of GATT, in fact, is designed fairly well to address this problem. And those architectural pillars are centrally the MFN, or most favored nation, or non-discrimination clause, and reciprocity. And finally, a shallow approach to integration. And those three things together, I argue in the book, seem well designed to serve the purpose of allowing countries to escape from a terms of trade-driven prisoner's dilemma with a minimum sacrifice of national sovereignty. And in essence, how do MFN and reciprocity simplify the fundamental tariff bargaining problem that would allow countries to bargain out of this prisoner's dilemma? Well, MFN preserves the simplicity of the terms of trade externality in a many country world, because it essentially reduces the proliferation of world prices, which combine to give us the terms of trade in a world of many countries. So the non-discrimination principle just keeps that externality running in a very simple way. And then reciprocity, which is essentially a rule that says if we change our tariffs either in the downward direction or in the upward direction, we're going to do it in a balanced way that essentially neutralizes our terms of trade externalities on each other. Well, if you're moving tariffs in a reciprocal way that neutralizes the terms of trade externality, those terms of trade movements are zero-sum movements, and that allows you to focus on the positive sum movements of liberalization, which are everything but the terms of trade movements that we might have in a negotiation. So in a nutshell, those are the reasons that MFN and reciprocity and formal models prove to be a very simple way of configuring bargaining over tariffs in a way that seemed pretty well designed to exactly neutralize the terms of trade problem, which seems at the heart, according to these models, of the problem that you want to neutralize. And the economics of logic of shallow integration is also sound. And in the slides, I put in details that give some simple formulas and math about how that works. And those are at the end of the slides I think those slides are posted on the webpage and people are welcome to look at them. But essentially the intuition is the following, that according to the terms of trade theory and in economics more generally, the tariff is the first best instrument for manipulating the terms of trade. In fact, it's essentially, that's the only thing a tariff is the first best instrument for doing, is manipulating the terms of trade. We know that from basic neoclassical trade theory. And what that means then is, well, if we didn't have a GATT and we were starting in a non-cooperative setting and trying to design an institution that could help us cooperate to more efficient outcomes, then we would be in a Nash equilibrium. That would be an equilibrium where all policies are non-cooperatively set. And in that Nash equilibrium, the tariffs would be inefficiently high because all countries would be using their tariffs to manipulate the terms of trade in their first best way. But an application of the targeting principle, which is also a famous and well thought of principle in economics, says that, well, if you've got the first best instrument for doing what you want to do, you're not going to distort any other policies that you have. And in particular, tariffs would be distorted too high. But the non-tariff policies, all the behind the border measures at the beginning of GATT would have been set efficiently because there was no reason that countries needed to use other instruments, other policies to manipulate their terms of trade. They have the tariff unconstrained by tariff agreements to do it. And while that sounds sort of abstract, and yes, you can say that, yeah, I could have told you that, from basic undergraduate international economics course, that the tariff is the first best instrument for manipulating the terms of trade, and that the targeting principle says you should always use the first best instrument and not distort any of your other policies. Well, that seems kind of abstract. It turns out that James Meade, who was instrumental in designing the GATT and became a Nobel laureate eventually, has had much of this in mind when he was thinking about how the GATT should be designed. So here's a quick quote from James Meade's book, The Theory of International Economic Policy. And what he says is, the restoration of greater freedom for international trade and factor movements can be made meaningful only by means of international agreements, which cut rather deeply into domestic economic arrangements. One cannot hope to see the abandonment of protective devices except in the framework of all-around international agreement, since unilateral action is quite likely to cause the free trade country to lose more from a deterioration in its terms of trade than it gains from the expansion of trade. So there, James Meade is essentially saying, once you're stuck in a terms of trade prisoner dilemma, if I were to say this is crazy, I should go back and liberalize, well, I would lose more from the deterioration in my terms of trade from unilaterally liberalizing than I would from the gains in efficiency. So that's exactly what the terms of trade theory says is the problem. And that's why James Meade says you need an international agreement to handle this. And that's, in essence, exactly the statement of the terms of trade theory about the purpose of an agreement. So Meade goes on and he says, but as soon as any attempt is made to limit protective devices, a whole host of domestic economic arrangements must be brought under examination. Tariffs and quantitative import restrictions are not the only means for protecting domestic industries. Subsidies, domestic taxes, domestic price and quantity controls, nationalization schemes, all can be used for similar purposes. So that's a statement saying that once you reduce the tariff and constrain your tariff from your first best terms of trade manipulating level, you're going to have a reason to start distorting these other policies for second best purposes of manipulating the terms of trade. And he goes on, James Meade goes on and says, yet all of these instruments may be perfectly legitimate instruments of policy for the attainment of certain other perfectly legitimate objectives. So that's the statement that, well, in the Nash equilibrium, they were set in ways that were perfectly legitimate, not necessarily laissez-faire. The problem is when you start to mess with constraints on tariffs, you're going to introduce problems into these behind-the-border measures. And what he then concludes is, he says, if a more liberal international economy is to be established by international agreement, one must search for a working compromise between the need effectively to curb protection devices and the need to give national governments freedom to adopt effective domestic economic policies for the attainment of legitimate domestic objectives. Well, if I were going to write a quote myself, I couldn't have done better than what Mead did exactly there in 1955. Because in essence, that's what the interpretation of GATT is under the terms of trade theory, is in theory, a trade agreement could focus on lowering tariffs as a means of expanding market access, which in the language of the WTO is defined as conditions of competition between domestic producers and foreign producers, and expand trade volumes to efficient levels, and then put in place various market access preservation rules that apply to non-tariff policies and prevent governments from using their non-tariff policies to backslide on their market access commitments. And under GATT's approach, countries negotiate tariff bindings to make market access commitments, and the GATT articles provide exactly the accompanying market access preservation rules. And that's reflected, for example, in Petersman's quote where he observes that the function of most GATT rules, such as GATT Article 1 through 3 and 11, is to establish conditions of competition and to protect trading opportunities. Okay, so that's the...
So Bob, you have about 8 minutes left. Okay, perfect.
That's the essence of the argument, and so now I want to get to the evidence. Is there evidence that in fact, empirical evidence that that's what GATT's doing? And in the book, I go through a number of articles and focus on 3. I have links to 2 of them in the slides here, links to some discussion. But here I'm just going to focus on a paper that I wrote with Kyle Bagwell that focuses on 16 countries that negotiated accession to the WTO after its creation in 1995, and asks whether their agreed tariff cuts reflect the removal of market power considerations from their unilateral tariff choices, which is essentially what the theory says GATT ought to be doing. It turns out in a linear model, this tariff cut would be increasing in the initial import volume of each country. And more generally, it would be increasing in a measure of inverse trade elasticity, which I call NBR. And here are just 2 pictures. There are regressions to back this up, but these are plotting by decile. The first one is plotting by decile of import volumes of the countries under consideration on the horizontal axis. So these are the big import volume products, and these are the small import volume products. And then the vertical axis is the deviation from the mean of the tariff cut that they offer. And as you can see, for small import volumes, I offer very little tariff cut when I join the WTO. But for large import volumes, I offer very big tariff cuts. Exactly what the terms of trade theory would suggest if I'm getting rid of the market power that I had in the products where I had it when in my resulting tariffs. And this is the same thing now with the decile being the trade elasticity measure. Okay, so I've argued that the design should reflect purpose. The purpose is getting rid of a terms of trade, prisoner's dilemma, and that the design seems to suggest that, and the theory and the empirics seems to support it. So now I get to my final 5 minutes of asking, well, what about some of the new challenges? Can they be handled? And as I said, I'm only going to get to 2 of these at most, the China and the climate change. But I think these are 2 that would be interesting for this group, so let me forge ahead. The rise of large emerging markets led by China really leads to 3 interrelated challenges. The first is the non-reciprocity that is pretty clear in China's accession to the WTO, and the rebalancing of market access commitments with China that probably needs to be taken under consideration. So China's 2001 accession to the WTO has challenged an approach to globalization that was designed fundamentally with market economies in mind. But the key thing is, if one looks at the same question is, well, does the presence of China Inc., as Mark Wu famously characterized the non-market features of China, does it change the purpose of a trade agreement? And the answer is, it actually doesn't. Doesn't change it in the least, according to the analysis that I'm pursuing. What it does change is the nature of the commitments that China must make to translate its tariff bindings into secure market access commitments. And as I argue in the book, that process by which non-violation clauses are used could help provide a promising path for China to have the most autonomy to find the ways that it best would view as making secure market access commitments to other WTO members, and ones that its current accession protocol have not succeeded in. And I'll just note that this is not the first time that the GATT or WTO has dealt with countries, non-market economies joining its practice. And in particular, back in the GATT years, Poland joined. And a really interesting protocol was that here's Poland's protocol for accession. Basically, the guts of it is paragraph 1, which says, subject to paragraph 2, Poland shall, with effect from the date of this protocol, undertake to increase the total value of its imports from the territories of contracting parties by not less than 7% per annum. So what Poland was doing was achieving reciprocity by saying, we know that any tariff commitments we make don't really mean much because we don't have market prices in our economy. So what we're going to do is try to assess with you the expected growth of our exports. We think it's going to be about 7% per annum, and we're going to commit to grow our imports by 7% per annum. And then paragraph 2 says, well, under Article 28 renegotiations, every 3 years or whenever we need to, we'll reassess this, and if we're off target, we'll alter what we're doing to maintain reciprocity. And that's the simple point, is that in a sense, that's exactly the kind of thing that China needs to be able to do. It doesn't need to be able to move to a market economy. Poland, when it joined in that protocol accession, was 1967. It had no intent, and no one thought it was going to move to a market economy. And it was just given this alternative kind of protocol. So that's the upshot for China. There are other issues, and in the interest of time, since I've only got 1 minute left, I'm going to leave these to the slides and let you look at them. But I want to get to climate change, because this also is somewhat provocative implication. And that is, I think the WTO is well suited to accommodate efforts to address climate change. And if we took the Panglossian view that somehow the world was able to negotiate an enforceable climate accord that implemented carbon taxes, the increases in carbon taxes necessary to solve the problem, there's still the question of, how would the WTO accommodate those changes? And it turns out, according to the terms of trade theory, the WTO could accommodate those changes if it were willing to allow countries to impose carbon border adjustments to basically stem the carbon leakage problem. So in some sense, there is a very sound view, in my view, tethered to the GATT WTO, that says carbon border adjustments are a completely plausible and acceptable policy given the logic of the GATT. But there's a key difference between what, say, Europe is proposing with CBAM and what comes out of the theory. And that is, these carbon border adjustments should not depend on the carbon content of the production of one's trading partners. So they shouldn't be different for China and India versus for the US when Europe puts on carbon border adjustments, simply because China and India are exporting dirtier goods. Instead, the carbon border adjustments, the purpose of them is to mitigate the market access implications of Europe's increasing carbon taxes. And that is about Europe's own carbon content. That is what's going to determine how much of a loss of competitiveness European producers face when those carbon taxes come on. And that's an MFN carbon border adjustment that can be installed. Okay, I think I'm out of time, so I'm going to leave the rest. There's lots more in the slides that if you're interested, you can look at them, but I'll come right to the conclusion and just say that I've argued that the GATT's design transcends many of them, though not all, of the current challenges faced by the WTO. And more broadly, I just want to leave us with a message that with the literature I'm surveying suggests that trade agreements that lack deep integration provisions are not necessarily weak agreements, that the shallow integration approach of GATT and the WTO is strongly supported by theory and also by empirics. And the second point I'll leave us with is that the primary task for the GATT WTO may nevertheless have shifted, and that is to help countries, rather than help them move toward the efficiency frontier, which was the task of the 20th century. Now we may be close to the efficiency frontier, and the task of a trade agreement like the WTO is to help us keep on the efficiency frontier as we face various shocks. And in principle, I think the WTO's flexibilities are well designed to do that, and that's why my suggestion is we ought to keep calm and carry on with the WTO. Let me stop there.
Thank you very much, Bob, for that very broad overview of both your fundamental papers, but also the application to a modern WTO. A lot of food for thought as we go into MC12. And I do think it's interesting that the sort of fundamental theories that you lay out, I think, are often differ from the kind of rhetoric we hear from politicians who are pushing for either free trade or managed trade, although I think your arguments seem to come more into the category that there's practical trade management things here that the mechanism, the WTO agreement mechanism allows. But I do have a question for you, Bob. Given the I don't know how familiar you are with the day-to-day negotiations, but it does seem to me that the high-level theoretical view that you lay out suggests that negotiations need to be much more practical focused and to some extent driven by empirics, when often the negotiations are driven much more by sort of political, I don't want to say grandstanding, but certainly different political positions. So arguments over whether or not a fundamental principle is a market economy. Anyway, do you have ideas for how to not just conceptually approach the agreement, but to how to get negotiators, government officials, to make better use of the existing agreements and any further adaptations or modifications? Long question. I apologize for that.
Yeah, that's a great question. It's a big question, and it's deservedly big, given that my talk was broad. So I was definitely rushing to get through a whole lot of broad things, and so I think it's fair that you ask that big broad question of how can we do this. And so I'll answer it by narrowing down a little. But for example, I think China is a crucial issue that WTO members need to come to grips with almost before anything else can be done. And there, I would argue that it's really important, in my view, to at least be open-minded to the notion that that the WTO and GATT before it its applicability is not inherently limited to countries that are market economies, that one can accommodate non-market economies with creative ways to both allow the other WTO members to enjoy reciprocal benefits of having non-market economies be members, and also to allow the non-market economy to enjoy the reciprocal benefits of being part of the WTO. And as a first point, I think just even pointing out and bringing back history can actually help at least open eyes, and that history of Poland, for example, is a good one to start with, to think Well, yes, of course, Poland was not, anywhere near the size and importance that China is today, and that is a crucial element. But in some ways, Poland is a pretty interesting, lesson for how we might approach China today, because there were some non-market economies who were joining, Hungary and others, who basically, when they joined, it was pretty clear that they were going to transition to market economies, and so the protocols of accession were quite a bit different for Vietnam and other non-market economies who came in, and it was pretty clear that yes, this is a temporary thing, and they're going to become market economies. So we just need some temporary things to get us through, and then the usual rules that apply to everybody, every market economy will do what we need for them. And in some ways, China, I think the original 2001 China accession, that was how it was viewed, was that many industrialized countries viewed China as either implicitly or explicitly making promises that they were going to move toward a market economy, and that was part of the logic of the protocols of accession, that eventually China was going to basically move to the market economy, and the articles that apply to everybody would apply to China in a practical way and make it work. And I think what happened was China did not move, and now seems to have no real intention of moving toward a market economy or to a market economy. And so in some ways, we started out with accession protocols that were more mirrored like ones for Vietnam or other countries that we thought and were moving to market economies. And now we're at a point where maybe we should have been looking at accession protocols like Poland, because it was not expected that Poland was going to move to a market economy. It was a view that, well, we got to find some way to allow Poland to make reciprocal commitments, and the way we'll do it is we'll just make quantity commitments, and that's the way we're going to handle it. So, in answer to your managed trade thing, I think there is a role for that kind of managed trade when you carve out economies that are fundamentally non-market. I wouldn't argue that that you should be doing this for market economies. I think the articles of GATT that serve this sort of market access preservation purpose. So you negotiate market access through tariff reductions, but then the other articles keep you from undercutting those tariff reductions with other behind the border measures. That's the essence of shallow integration. I think that is exactly a way that countries should be doing this. But when you have a non-market economy who is not going to be transitioning to a market economy, then I think you want to be creative. And then I think a view of managed trade is not a crazy thing. And I guess that's a long-winded way of saying, to make it practical, maybe just, looking at some of the history and seeing, I'm not saying that it would work perfectly, but I'm just saying, for China to be able to figure out, okay, it's not that we need to transition to a market economy. That's not what the WTO members should be and have a right to demand for us. But they do have a right to demand that we make secure market access commitments like everybody does. And we've got to find a way to do that. And part of that might be some quantitative commitments that we agree to. And there's certainly a history of that. And that kind of conversation, I think, might actually have a practical implication and move people to, think a little bit more about this. So that's just one, a long-winded answer to your broad question on a narrow topic, which is China. But I think a topic that's, crucial. Like if we don't get progress on China, we're not probably going to get progress in the WTO on much else.
Well, thanks, Bob. I will say there's lots of provisions and flexibilities built within the agreements that some people argue is a real problem, and other people say it's what helps keep the system together. We see that right now around economic security questions. So, as well as in the COVID-19 and vaccine responses. But let me move on. We got a couple questions in the chat. One is from Alan Fox at USITC, looking at carbon border adjustment mechanism. Using the BCA to ensure that imported goods face the same carbon pricing signal seems analogous to the payment of VAT on imports to markets that use a VAT. Its purpose is to communicate the appropriate pricing signal to different exporters. Why should embodied carbon be treated differently than embodied labor and capital, i.e. value added?
Let's see. Yeah, so if I'm understanding Alan's question correctly, if I understand it correctly, that would be saying that that the carbon border adjustment in that case would be MFN, in the sense that it would be handling the VATs within Europe, say, and that adjustment then is just neutralizing their the effects of their carbon or of their VATs. And in that sense, if I'm understanding Alan correctly, then I would agree that that's in essence the logic is you just don't want to have you want to have the carbon taxes have a neutral competitive effect. And just like you have border adjustments for VATs to neutralize the competitive effect of a VAT, you want to have that with carbon taxes. And that's, that would not imply that I'm going to be putting a carbon tax on China based on China's carbon content that is then going to differ from my carbon tax on the US based on the US's carbon tax content, just like for the border adjustments that the EU does to its VAT. It doesn't have discriminatory ones based to China versus the US. So I think if I'm understanding his question correctly, I would agree with him. That's a good way to think about the logic.
Okay, Alan, do you think Bob got your question correctly? I don't know if he can weigh in or not. In the meantime, we have another.
Yeah, we can. I'd be happy to continue offline with Alan. That would be great. I'd learn a lot. Yeah, and then I see the second one. That's a great question. Oh, sorry. Do you want to read it to everybody?
Well, if you don't have the chat open, it's Krishna Gupta is essentially asking, do you think Donald Trump's approach to China sort of makes sense, or asking Bob what he thinks of it, given China's commitment to import a certain amount from the U.S.?
Right, and yeah, it's a great question, and I would, I'd want to answer that in a careful way, and the way I would want to answer it is I think there is a kernel of correctness perhaps in a number of Donald Trump's policies, but in my own personal view, the execution of those policies is almost always disastrous. So the devil's in the details. So on this particular issue, one difference between what I'm suggesting here and what the Trump administration did was, for the Trump administration, it was not a rules-based negotiation between China and the U.S., where the U.S. Perhaps went through the WTO and said China is not has not carried out reciprocal commitments to us, and we need China, and that's where I mentioned in the slides a non-violation clause. So let me just quickly describe how that would work. If the U.S. were to bring a non-violation complaint against China, it would be essentially a complaint that said, well, we're not sure that we could actually make violation claims to prove that China has actually violated the letter of actual commitments, but China has undertaken actions which have had the effect of leaving our expectations, our legitimate expectations of reciprocal market access to China unmet. And that's a non-violation clause that claim that if the WTO court finds in favor of the U.S., then China has the following choices. It doesn't have to change its policies. it could say, well, we're not going to change our policies because we want a non-market system, and we can't think of a single way to make our commitments of market access more credible without undoing our non-market system. So we're not changing. Well, in that case, the WTO court would then authorize the U.S. to go ahead and reciprocally withdraw its concessions to restore the balance of reciprocity that was supposed to be established in the original negotiation between the U.S. and China. So in that sense, you could argue, well, maybe that's what Trump was trying to get at, because he was imposing these tariffs as a bargaining chip with a hope that eventually China would, lower its tariffs and increase market access, and then the U.S. would take off its tariffs. But there are many differences between what I'm suggesting that the U.S. do with the non-violation clause and what Trump did, including that what he was doing was bilateral, so it had no third-party protections, that China wouldn't do something as a solution which would hurt Europe in order to help help the U.S. And there are many other things. So very quickly, my bottom line is I totally am sympathetic to the question. I think about it often too, and I hope in the book that I've had more time to talk about it, I explain why, and clearly the approach that Trump took is antithetical to what I'm suggesting, even though there's a family resemblance at some level, and the idea that quantitative targets might be a reasonable thing in the right hands for China is something that is reasonable, and that also is a family resemblance to what Trump was after. So that's as much as I can give Trump.
Thanks, Bob.
In my view.
Thanks, Bob. Well, that was a great tour de force of a broad set of literature, and thanks for focusing on those two aspects of non-market economy and climate change. I think we do need to move on here. Wish we had more time. Wish there was a coffee break where people could pin you down and follow up with more questions. I think there'd be a lot. Great stuff and very important. Great timing. Now we're going to have this transition before Trudi makes her presentation. In the meantime, I'd like to call out a certain person participating in this conference, some longstanding GTAP participant and contributor. Mr. Sherman Robinson is experiencing a birthday, Sherman. So we'd all like to say happy birthday to Sherman. So please, everybody, in a virtual way, say, there we go, Laurent, everybody. Yep, all right, show those celebrations. Happy birthday, Sherman. And glad you could join us.
Thank you all. This process of having an 80th birthday is an ongoing process, and I'm enjoying it.
Yeah, well, good. You revealed the age, not me, but I'm glad you're proud of it. I would never have guessed. So congratulations, Sherman. And now I'm going to use that as our break, our 1 minute transition, and now we'll transition to Trudi. Trudi, if you could show up again and tee up your presentation. Trudi is the Executive Director of the Trade Law Center, TRALOC. Her research is in the areas of international trade, competition policy, industrial development, and Africa's integration agenda. She has a special interest in and commitment to capacity building, which is very, very important. And I'd love to talk to her someday about that in a little more detail. She has designed and delivered academic and tailored short courses on a broad range of trade-related topics for policymakers in Africa. And now she's going to share her views on the African Continental Free Trade Agreement and opportunities for regional integration. So Trudi, looking, there you are, and you're starting to share your screen, and the floor is yours. I'll let you know when you're about halfway through and with about 10 minutes to go. Okay, thank you.
Thank you so much, Bob, and good afternoon. I'm calling in from Cape Town this afternoon, and Sherman, I'm very happy to add my congratulations to you as well for a very happy birthday. Thank you so much for the invitation to bring the African Continental Free Trade Area to this discussion at the GTAP conference this year. The African Continental Free Trade Area, colleagues, is of course Africa's most ambitious integration initiative. The aim is eventually to incorporate all 55 member states of the African Union. Regional integration has been for many, many years, many decades, in fact, an important feature of Africa's development strategy. So we still find references to regional integration in the national development plans of the member states of the African Union. African integration is anchored in regional economic communities, such as the Southern African Economic Development Community, the East African Community, the Community of West African States, ECOWAS, and many others, literally. A point of reference when we take a look at African integration is often the Abuja Treaty from 1991. It entered into force in 1994, and this is seen as a blueprint for continental integration. It had a very clear stepwise process for integration, but it's never been implemented. Nevertheless, the spirit of the Abuja Treaty lives on and is often still referenced in the context of the discussion of the African Continental Free Trade Area. The regional economic communities are very much member-driven, and many of them have dominant members, and they drive the agenda for that particular sub-region quite substantively. It's important to note that across the continent in these regional economic communities, there is still a lot of work in progress. They are designed so that there is flexibility, and this is particularly important to the member states, to accommodate their particular development challenges. It does bring certain complications for the private sector, for traders, for investors, and for those seeking opportunities to establish commercial presence across borders in the sub-regions and beyond that. We find in recent years very strong tensions between the imperative to liberalize and to protect, particularly domestic industry. And it's not a surprise at all that industrialization, Africa's industrial development, in particular regional industrialization, has become an important feature of the regional economic community agendas. Overall, it's fair to say that integrating unequal partners poses specific challenges, and this is evident not only in the African Continental Free Trade Area, but also in all of the regional economic communities. If we focus on the Afcfta, the African Continental Free Trade Area, it has two lives. On the one hand, it is a free trade area, or it will be more correctly a free trade area, and it is also a flagship project of the African Union. There are a number of other flagship projects, some of which are very familiar to us, focusing on agricultural development, industrial development, infrastructure development, and many, many more. One of them is the project to boost intra-Africa trade. And in fact, this has been particularly important in terms of inspiring the establishment of a continental free trade area, noting that intra-Africa trade remains particularly low by global standards, comparisons with other sub-regions. In recent years, intra-Africa trade has hovered between 15, 16, and 18%. This is particularly important because it means that more than 80% of Africa's trade is still with global trade partners, and therefore provisions within the Afcfta recognizing the importance of agreements with third parties have to be noted. Very important, there is a legal compact that constitutes the African Continental Free Trade Area. There is an agreement establishing the Afcfta, a number of protocols with detailed annexes, a protocol on trade in goods, trade in services, on dispute settlement, and more recently, the members have added a protocol, still under negotiation, on investment, one on competition policy, and another on intellectual property rights. Even more recently, new disciplines have been added, and we're looking now to start negotiations on digital trade, This agenda has been expanded from an initial focus on e-commerce. So we're now covering not only digitally ordered trade, but also digitally delivered trade, which certainly is important for many, many African countries. We will also negotiate a protocol on women and youth in trade. And I'm particularly pleased to note the progress that we're making in that regard. The Afcfta, as all the regional economic communities, remains member-driven. So the member states will move ahead at the pace and as far as they deem appropriate. And this does mean that sometimes things take a lot longer than we might wish from an outside perspective. Obligations will be implemented progressively. So the Afcfta will be implemented over a rather long period of time. As I've mentioned, it is a free trade area. There is reference to the establishment, without any kind of timeline, to the establishment of a customs union. This is interesting to note because certainly the appetite for establishing customs unions on the African continent have declined in recent years. The Afcfta design is a particularly important one. It's a coexistence model or a parallelism model, recognizing the existence of the regional economic communities. They will continue to exist. So effectively, we're looking at the Afcfta to liberalize trade amongst those member states of the African Union that currently trade without preferences, trading according to the rules of the WTO. This is quite important to keep in mind. The REC FTAs are recognized as building blocks. And one of the principles of the Afcfta is the preservation of this acquis. The acquis, a principle we have adopted from European Economic Community law in the context of the tripartite free trade area negotiations, which predated the start of the negotiations to conclude the Afcfta. There is detailed provision for an institutional architecture for managing the affairs of the Afcfta, and a very important link to the institutions of the African Union. The apex decision-making body is the African Union Assembly, and that's quite important, the connection to the broader African development and integration agenda of the African Union. But importantly, we have already established a secretariat, which is now based in Accra. It is now responsible for the management and the arrangement of the negotiating process. It also is mandated to play a very important role in the implementation, monitoring, evaluation, impact assessment of the Afcfta. This is yet to begin. It's always important when we talk about regional economic integration in Africa to do a reality check and to assess what the real barriers to intra-Africa trade and the sources of the high transaction costs of cross-border business economic activities are. And it's no surprise that these are found in the non-tariff area. And this makes the trade facilitation agenda of the Afcfta and particular instruments focusing on the elimination of non-tariff barriers particularly important. We should note, just as a side comment, that if the member states of the African Union that belong to the WTO were to effectively implement their commitments under the trade facilitation agreement of the WTO, they would in fact be implementing their commitments under the Afcfta. We have borrowed rather liberally from those instruments. If we take a look at the overall scope of the agreement, therefore, it is quite important to note that the non-tariff barrier impact is still perhaps where the greatest benefits to integration under the Afcfta will be found. I want to refer to a study, and since we're in the GTAP community, this is quite important. This is a study done by two GTAP community members a few years ago, Hans Grinstead Jensen and Ron Sandry, and I'm extremely pleased that they were working with us on the project. And the results that they found, and perhaps I can just refer to this very briefly, especially impressive results with a forecast by simulating a modest 20% reduction in the costs associated with a particular African problem of transit time, delays at customs, time on the road effectively. This 20% reduction in transit time completely dwarfed the results of liberalizing tariffs completely across the continent. And this still inspires a number of other studies that are being undertaken by institutions such as the Economic Commission for Africa. This is just a reminder about the basic principles of the Afcfta. I have mentioned the preservation of the acquis. Reciprocity, particularly important, as well as we've heard in the earlier discussion in Bob's presentation. Variable geometry, flexibility, and special and differential treatment are also enshrined in the agreement. At this point, we focus very much on variable geometry and flexibility, not so much focus on special and differential treatment. But this is important, colleagues, keeping in mind that 33 of the world's least developed countries are in Africa. 16 of them are landlocked. And then, of course, we have small island developing economies. So within the scope of variable geometry, we're actually taking a look at longer implementation timeframes in terms of tariff phase down. But the level of ambition, for example, for tariff liberalization is 90% of tariff lines across the board. This is just a reminder that regional integration in Africa is complex, and the coexistence model includes a number of important reminders. The African Union recognizes 8 regional economic communities. These are the 8. The Common Market for East and Southern Africa, Southern African Development Community, East African Community, and the others. 4 of these have no trading arrangements, no FTAs yet. ECOWAS, SADC, COMESA, and EAC have either FTAs or are indeed purported to be customs unions. However, the overlapping membership and the proliferation of regional economic communities way beyond the 8 that we have here mean that if we take a look at, for example, bilateral trade between members of the Arab Maghreb Union, they will be trading under preferences because most of them belong, for example, to the Grand Arab Free Trade Area, integrating North African member states with the countries in the Middle East. But if we're looking only at 8 recognized economic communities that are indeed recognized in the Afcfta, what are the other regional integration arrangements? And I want to mention just one of these. And this is the oldest functioning customs union in the world, the Southern African Customs Union. Its origins date back to the late 1890s, to the colonial era, where Great Britain, which in fact wanted to manage its fiscal and trade matters more effectively, looked at certain measures, management procedures for the territories in Southern Africa that it controlled. Namibia was not one of those at the time. It has a measure of fiscal integration because SACU is also an excise union. And all but Botswana belong to the Common Monetary Area, indicating the deep integration that exists already within SACU. Similarly, we could have a look at some of the other regional economic communities. I'll skip through this. This is just an overview of the legal compact that is the African Continental Free Trade Area. Where do we stand at the moment, colleagues? And this is quite important to keep in mind. At this point, 43 member states have ratified the African Continental Free Trade Area. The agreement is in force since the 30th of May 2019, but we cannot trade under the agreement yet. So as we sit here today, in fact, this week, the Committee for Trade and Goods, the Afcfta Committee for Trade and Goods is meeting in Accra. We cannot trade under the agreement. How does this come about? A little bit of history here. At the 2012 African Union Assembly, a decision was made by heads of state to expeditiously establish a continental free trade area. Negotiations began in 2015 and initially progressed particularly well. So much so that the political impetus for moving towards adoption, signature, and ratification of the agreement led to a decision that an extraordinary summit should be held. That took place in Kigali in March 2018, and the agreement was duly presented for signature and ratification. This proceeded at pace so that by the 30th of April, we had reached the requisite threshold of 22 ratifications. 30 days later, the agreement could enter into force. But the minimum requirements for an FTA for trade and goods were not in place yet. Tariff negotiations and the preferential rules of origin, which are essentially building blocks for free trade agreement to exist, simply were not there yet. Keep in mind, there are services negotiations as well. These are still underway. There has been an attempt to start trade under the Afcfta, and the Assembly again made an announcement that on the 1st of January 2021, we should start trading. Unfortunately, that was not possible because, again, we simply have not reached the threshold where we have tariff concessions in place among the member states and the preferential rules of origin in place. So right now, negotiations continue. Both state parties, those that have ratified the agreement, and non-state parties continue. It's a very inclusive process. We're now
We have about 10 minutes left, Trudi, okay? 10 minutes.
Thanks, Bob. There is now a concerted effort to get to the start of commercially meaningful trade. This is the terminology now being used. The Council of Ministers for Trade convened in Accra in January this year and prepared a draft decision for consideration by the African Union Assembly, so by heads of state and government, so that trade could start. At that point, we had reached agreement on rules of origin for 87.7 tariff lines. I mean, it's moved now up to 87.8. But not all member states have been comfortable to make offers of tariff concessions, particularly for those goods whose rules of origin have not been agreed. Rules of origin play a particularly important role for many African countries, not only as a source of fiscal revenue, but to protect domestic industry from import competition. So it remains particularly sensitive. What we're looking at now is a decision at the beginning of July so that we can start commercially meaningful trade. What can we expect? There are a number of possibilities, and it might be that the Council of Ministers considers a reduction in the level of ambition, so that in fact, we agree on the rules of origin, say for 87.8 or 89% of tariff lines. That would increase the comfort for member states to make offers of tariff concessions. Once those have been verified, technically verified by the Afcfta Secretariat, they may well then have a basis for the start of trade. The rest of the negotiations, the aim is to complete the full set of negotiations by end of September this year. It's unlikely that we will be able to meet those deadlines. Why is it taking so long? The level of ambition arguably is high. 90% of tariff line liberalization is particularly high for some of the smaller, least developed countries. They do have a longer time frame to reduce tariffs, but still that is a fairly high level of ambition. So it's not surprising that we do find there are some challenges. What does the AFCFTA bring to Africa's integration agenda? Are we seeing a shift perhaps to a new track? And I would argue at this stage that we should recognize that the AFCFTA has generated renewed political interest and support at a level we haven't seen possibly for more than 2 decades. Also renewed interest from the private sector in regional integration. And very importantly, the level of global interest in the AFCFTA has certainly surprised me. But at the end of the day, more than 80% of Africa's trade is still with global partners. Clearly, it's commodity-based trade, so I think that's really important to keep in mind. The AFCFTA is perhaps engendering a more realistic approach in terms of the balance of emphasis, the importance on trade facilitation, including a lot of emphasis on customs and border management, administrative cooperation, and to some extent digitization of these processes of customs and border management, and the elimination of non-tariff barriers. There's a portal for the monitoring, notification, and eliminating of NTBs. And this elimination process is linked to dispute settlement options. And that's quite important to keep in mind. There's also focus, and I think this is really important, on frameworks for regulatory cooperation. The focus on the behind the border issues, I think, is really important. What can the AFCFTA do in terms of improving domestic trade governance, administrative justice? So contributing, for example, not only to trade facilitation, but also investment facilitation. I think these are some of the exciting opportunities and developments. The AFCFTA is now explicitly linked to Africa's industrialization ambition. It's now regarded as a framework for continental industrialization and support to the development of continental value chains. This is an interesting dynamic and very important, recognizing that perhaps the major challenge that many African countries face is the lack of capacity to produce tradables competitively. The services and digital trade agenda, it's a developing agenda. I think there's a lot of work that has to happen at national level in terms of domestic policy, regulation, institutions, for example, to manage data governance issues, protection of personal information, consumer protection, and so much more. Unfortunately, most African countries, members of the WTO, do not participate in the plurilaterals, where many of these issues are in fact on the agenda. I think this is an area of work that we need to pay a lot of attention to. Essentially, the AFCFTA explicitly recognizes different streams of integration on the continent. No one size fits all. REC FTAs and customs unions exist and will continue to grow. You may have noted that in the last couple of months, the Democratic Republic of the Congo acceded to the East African community. And in recent months, the member states of the Southern African Development Community adopted, and it has entered into force, a protocol on trade and services. So these agendas will continue, they will remain important, because if one has to take a look at the depth of integration that already exists and some of the metrics related to intra-Africa trade, this is highly concentrated within the regional economic communities. So the neighborhood effects will remain important. And unless we substantively address many of the challenges associated with high transaction costs of trade across the continent, given its geography, we may not in the immediate future see a change to that profile. Finally, Bob, my last sentence is that the AFCFTA may well be paving a way for a more realistic integration agenda. There are still some important issues which are not on the agenda: sustainable development, climate, labor and social provisions are not yet being discussed in the context of the AFCFTA. But I'm certainly hopeful that they will be incorporated. At the end of the day, it's member-driven, and the member states, recognizing the importance of these issues, can be expected to bring them to the table. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Trudi, for that excellent overview and actually a deep dive into some of the elements of both the agreements and the history, the evolution. We had some questions, 2 questions in the stream, but before we get there, one of the points you make, I'll use my moderator's privilege here to ask a question first. You point out that 80% of the trade in Africa is with the rest of the world. There isn't much regional integration. When you look at global trade from a global value chain perspective, you see significant regional concentration of trade where regions compete with one another. Essentially, you've got Asia, Europe, and North America. And a real challenge, I think, for Africa as well as perhaps South America is how to build its regional competitiveness to better integrate into global value chains. So your point, one of your points in that initial study was the role of just trade facilitation, cross-border movement of goods, trade costs, not just tariffs. That sounds like it would be a big step forward. I know the tariff negotiations are ongoing, but this trade facilitation aspect, this cross-border movement aspect is something that is very important. What do you see for the prospects of that? Is it tied to the tariff negotiations, or is it a separate track? And I do know that the WTO has its trade facilitation agreement. The World Bank and other funding institutions are trying to reduce those cross-border trade costs. So any quick reactions there, and then we'll turn to the other questions.
Absolutely, Bob. There are a number of initiatives running in parallel, not only implementation of WTO commitments, but within the regional economic communities themselves. They have their own transport and trade facilitation programs. So there are a number of initiatives that are concurrent, so to speak. And we're hoping that these will also, in a sense, pull along the implementation of the provisions in the 4 annexes effectively to the Protocol on Trade and Goods that deal with trade facilitation issues and elimination of non-tariff barriers. But so much depends on domestic governance improvements. What happens at the border is not disconnected to those domestic governance issues. And this is my hope, certainly, that the AFCFTA can provide some impetus to those improvements, whether it be in terms of customs and border management, digitization processes, and so on, but also taking a look at, for example, the quality infrastructure. So quality assurance infrastructure, which remains particularly weak and forms part of this broader trade management and trade governance collection of issues that needs addressing. So I'm hopeful it will, but and there's no reason why it can't proceed without tariff and rules of origin dispensations in place yet.
Okay. Well, thank you. I think a somewhat related question came from Anton Pouet. Trudi, what would the consequences of AFCFTA on informal trade? What might they be on informal trade? And will there be, with this agreement, an improvement to the quality of trade data in Africa? We know Antoine's done a lot of work in this area, very helpful work. So your response, please.
Thanks so much, Antoine, for that. Clearly, the data, the metrics I've mentioned relate to formal trade. And I must admit also that the quality of formal trade leaves quite a lot to be desired. But the very broad category of informal or small-scale trade, as we may call it, is of course not reflected there. There are a number of initiatives to improve collection of that data via surveys and so on. And taking a look at the AFCFTA agenda, there are important areas under discussion. simplified trade regimes, for example, but also within, for example, the Protocol on Women, Youth and Trade. This, in my view, is an opportunity to focus on specific issues impacting small-scale traders who are women. In most of the sub-regions, they're predominantly women traders, informal cross-border traders, taking a look at the practical border management issues and challenges that they face, and looking at the implementation of the annexes, focusing on customs and border management, customs cooperation, and so on, where some of these issues can be addressed. So very definitely this is on the agenda. It's a major development issue because small-scale trade or informal cross-border trade is so closely linked to development outcomes, not only in border communities, but it is very material to food security issues, for example, on a much broader geography. So this is enjoying some attention. In fact, this week, discussions about the simplified trade regime, which some regional economic communities have already adopted. The Common Market for East and Southern Africa has a very functional, very effective simplified trade regime with a de minimis rule and with a number of practical customs and border management support processes available. By contrast, others such as the Southern African Development Community doesn't have one at all. So there is progress, and hopefully through a first mover advantage, so to speak, of some of the regs where there are demonstration effects of how important this can be, we'll see the Afcfta pull in the same direction.
Thanks, Trudi. I will add, by the way, from the WTO perspective, we have a project with UNCTAD to facilitate the introduction of Afcfta automatic reporting of formally collected trade data. So it doesn't get at Antoine's question on the informal, but we're trying to facilitate and improve the ability of customs officials to both collect and report the formal data, the formal trade recorded data. I will also note we have a technical assistance project to help build out GVC, global value chain, value added data in trade with a number of African countries, and we're doing that jointly with OECD. That way they can track their evolution of the value added and integration in their trade. Lars Nilsson from DG Trade has a question. Does the agreement as it currently stands provide for any concrete and tangible reductions in non-tariff barriers? I think you've partially addressed this, but anything you want to add for Lars?
Lars, this is particularly important. In fact, the Afcfta has taken a leaf from the tripartite free trade area, which introduced a portal, tradebarriers.org, some years ago, and some regional economic communities have followed in that track as well. This portal is open already, tradebarriers.africa, where any stakeholder, whether it be an informal cross-border trader, logistics supplier, or consumer, can log non-tariff barriers. These are then reviewed and referred to an appropriate government or related agency for resolution. The problem at this stage is it does not provide for systemic solution to these problems. This could arguably come through the dispute settlement channel, but keep in mind that dispute settlement provided for in the Afcfta is interstate dispute settlement. This is in contrast to some regional economic communities that provide standing for private parties. So in COMESA, East African Community, and ECOWAS, private firms can actually bring disputes. Private parties, let's keep it that way, can bring disputes. So this does have a bit of a principal agent problem, similar to what we see in the WTO, of course, where the private party has to lobby government. And at this point, the impetus, the appetite for intergovernmental disputes on trade matters is rather absent on the continent. So there is work to be done, but certainly some concerted efforts, recognition that this is a major area of of concern, adding transaction costs and certainly disproportionately impacting on the SMEs, which are the predominant form of business, and then the small and informal traders as well.
Thank you, Trudi. Janine Pelican has a question regarding food security, and she's asking if Afcfta might buffer the impact of the sharp rise of world market prices for cereals in the short term. Could that then provide an impetus to speed up the negotiations?
This is, of course, a very important concern for many African countries. The continent as a whole is food importing. And what we do see is this is where the potential support from other flagship projects, such as CARDIP, the Comprehensive Agricultural Development Program under the African Union, is so important. I think, Janine, in this regard, a very important feature of this endeavor to establish the African Continental Free Trade Area has been the development of complementary initiatives. And here we've seen, for example, that Afrexim Bank, Africa's premier trade finance institution, has moved well beyond its core business area of providing trade finance to support quality infrastructure, some agricultural development projects, and also supporting some customs and border management programs. It's also instrumental in supporting and putting rather a lot of money into the industrial development agenda. And I think the industrial development agenda, as well as the agricultural development agenda, in particular, the opportunity for expanding agricultural production, are particularly important in this context. I think there are concerns and recognition that there are opportunities to actually do a great deal more in terms of addressing our own food security issues, not only in terms of production, but also in terms of trade. So expedited border processes for food products, for example, these are definitely on the agenda.
Thanks, Trudi. I don't know if there's any quick follow-up that the questioners wanted to do. If not, I think we've reached the end of our session. Once again, I wish we had a coffee break following this so that we could have informal follow-on conversations. But you all know how to reach our two speakers, Trudi and Bob, should you have the desire to follow up with them. It's been great. We've got the global perspective, sort of conceptual view of why we have trade agreements and how they may, in some areas, need to be adapted for the 21st century, and in many ways not. And then we have one of the last regions of the world that's not really integrated, big development challenge, and the role of trade integration and its ability to facilitate economic development should be tested. And ideally, we have a positive outcome here over the next 5 to 15, 20 years. We all know trade negotiations take a long time. But with that, I'd like to thank the audience for joining us for this great plenary session. I'd like to thank the GTAP Center, Dominique in particular, but also Ginger for doing all the hard work coordinating this and shifting it online and making it so successful and getting two great speakers. So thank you all. And I wish you a great evening, afternoon, and morning, wherever you are. Thank you.